Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me. Looks like I'm getting the thumbs up. I want to welcome you to our Positive Links speaker series session on the war for kindness, building empathy in a fractured world. This series is presented by the Center for Positive Organizations here at the University of Michigan's Stephen Ross School of Business. My name is Ethan Kross. I'm a faculty associate at the Center for Positive Organizations, and I'm also a professor of psychology and management here at the University of Michigan. We're going to get into our discussion really quickly, but before I do that, just a few notes on the technology. As you stream in, you're going to be view only. So what that means is you're not going to be able to be seen or heard. We apologize, but we're not doing that today. You will have the ability to use a Q&A feature, and we are going to keep about 10 minutes at the end of the session to go over your questions. So do use that mechanism readily. And you can also up or down vote questions, or maybe just upvote, which is going to be really useful because when we get to the Q&A period, I'm going to look at which questions are most popular. The chat and raise hand functions are turned off, so there's nothing wrong with your computer if you can't use those. The Center for Positive Organizations does want to thank the Sanger Leadership Center, Tauber Institute for Global Operations, and the Samuel Zell and Robert Lurie Institute for Entrepreneurial Studies, as well as the Diane and Paul Jones for their sponsorship support of the 2022-23 Positive Links Speaker Series. So really, thank you very much to those sponsors for making this event possible. We also want to thank our series promotional partners, Ann Arbor Spark, and the Managerial and Organizational Cognition Division of the Academy of Management. All right, without further ado, it is my absolute pleasure to welcome my colleague and longtime friend, Jamil Zaki. There he is. How's it going, Jamil?
It's going great.
All right, well, you're going to have to just sit through an obnoxious introduction that I'm going to give of you. So for everyone here, Jamil and I are going to be very transparent with you about this. We've known each other for a really long time. We went to graduate school with each other. So that's about 20 years ago where we started learning how to do science. And we've been trying to stumble our way through that endeavor ever since, sharing lots of highs and some lows as well. Jamil Zaki is a tenured associate professor at Stanford. Currently, he has been there his entire career. He got his BA at Boston University in sad close proximity to the Red Sox, but we won't hold that against you. He then moved to Columbia, where he and I met and did a lot of research together, trying to understand neural systems and psychological processes involved in emotion control, and as you will hear about a lot today, empathy. After Columbia, he moved to Harvard, where he did a postdoc for a few years to dig deeper into the neural circuitry underlying empathy. And then he moved to Stanford, where in really record time, he emerged as arguably one of, if not the world leader in our understanding of empathy, our scientific understanding of empathy. He's published papers in the world's greatest journals, earned a slew of grants. Perhaps my favorite line on your CV, Jamil, is the Presidential Early Career Award for Scientists that you earned a couple of years ago, which, for those of you who are not familiar with it, is the most prestigious award that our government gives to scientists across all forms of science. And this guy over here, Jamil Zaki, got it for his research on empathy. So we're really an illustrious company. It's made even more illustrious because Jamil isn't just someone who gets elbow deep into the science. He also cares deeply and is remarkably good at translating what he studies for the world to consume and benefit from. He did it masterfully recently with, I'm going to do a shameless plug here, but it is deserved, for this wonderful book, The War for Kindness, that we're going to be talking about today, which, if you read books on nonfiction books on psychology, I think they tend to fall in one of two camps, really science heavy or science light and story driven. And what Jamil is able to do in this book is just wed those two pieces together seamlessly so that it is just this really enjoyable book to consume, and it will blow your mind. So I highly recommend it. So Jamil, sorry you had to sit through all that, but it is such a delight to have you here with us today. You ready to get started?
I am, yes. And I should say, not to introduce our introducer, but the very first talk that I ever saw when I got to grad school, no idea what I was going to do, how I was going to make it through my PhD, was Ethan's job talk, his practice for his talk that he then gave at Michigan. And it was one of the most inspirational moments of my career. So basically, my impression of Ethan was all downhill from there. No, but I'm thrilled to be joining you, and thank you, my friend, for being here.
Well, and that is probably true, Jamil. So I thank you for your candor. All right, well, let's get started. So there is a movement in science right now to take the scientist out of the science, and the idea here is that we need to be totally objective and just like let's only look at the facts. And I've got to say, I'm not a huge fan of that movement because I don't think it's possible to take the scientist completely out of the scientist. And it often removes just some of what I find to be remarkably interesting about science and how that is wedded to people's personal lived experiences. So before we get into nuts and bolts talk about empathy, I'd love for you to just share with everyone how you got interested in this space. What kind of launched your journey in this regard?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, Ethan, I totally share your perspective. I think it's so cool and interesting to find out about the people behind scientific research. I also think that's especially important for psychology. As you know, people in our field use the old saw that research is me search. That people get into something, get into studying a psychological phenomenon because it's meant something to them in their life, and that's absolutely true of me. So my parents are immigrants. My dad is from Pakistan and my mom is from Peru. And they both, by some fluke of history, ended up doing graduate school at Washington State University in Pullman. So they both flew from these cities, massive cities, Karachi and Lima, each bigger than New York City, to this tiny town and felt enormously out of place. And I think that they fell in love with each other because they both felt very much their foreignness and were able to comfort one another. But they also have basically nothing else in common besides that. So I'm their only child. And during a lot of my childhood, they really butted heads quite a bit and ended up getting a pretty long and pretty difficult divorce. And as their only child, I was sort of the bridge between their worlds, between their perspectives, across their conflicts, and between their very different cultures. So all three of us, we're in this tiny house with three people and three totally different cultural perspectives. It was not an easy time. I'm not going to pretend that it was, but it was a time for me of great discovery because I knew that my mom and dad were and are terrific people, and yet they had such trouble coming together or understanding each other's perspectives. So for a lot of my childhood, it felt like my biggest job was to understand each of them, was to bridge their versions of the world. And, I often say that my parents' divorce was like an empathy gym for me, right? It forced me to really work at understanding their perspectives. And I didn't know what the word empathy meant at this point. I was 7 years old, but I think that's what sparked my interest in how people connect and especially how we connect across difference.
Um, I'm just as you're talking, I'm thinking it's no surprise that we're such great friends because I'm an only child of two people who divorced as well, and so hearing you talk is very relatable. I want to share the first sentence of your book, which has always been very meaningful to me. I think it just captures what you described very powerfully, and it gives a snapshot into your ability as a writer. I was 8 years old when my parents began divorcing, but 12 by the time they finished. That's a really long time to have to manage warring parties, so to speak. And the fact that you're able to do so in such a positive light, I think speaks to the power of empathy that we're going to be talking about. One other thing before we dig into the nuts and bolts of empathy, often people talk about me search, this idea you used earlier. as people being driven to understand things that they experience deficits in.
Mm.
And I don't think that's true. And I think hearing your story really puts us to thinking about that term in the opposite domain. I mean, you seem like someone who is really good at empathy from the time you were a little kid. Is that a fair assumption to make?
No, I wouldn't say it's a fair assumption. Although I think it's a reason it's reasonable, but it turns out to be inaccurate. First of all, I totally agree with you that in general, I think that psychologists, in my opinion, when they do me search, when they do work that's related to them, I find that it's for one of two reasons that are quite opposing. I think sometimes people study the thing that confuses them that they don't have. And sometimes people study the thing that's really been definitive for them in their life. So, for instance, people who study how we regulate our feelings, I've met many of these people, and they tend to either be really terrific at regulating their feelings or struggle quite a bit with, with regulation. So I think that there's two versions of me search. I mean, for me, I would say that empathy, was not something was that always came easily to me. In fact, the reason that I think I find it so interesting is that during my parents' divorce, I found myself getting better and better at it. Not because it was something fun for me, but because it was almost like a survival skill, like I've said. And so it seemed to me like the same way that if you are stuck on a desert island, you might get really good at building shelters or fishing. For me, being the only one sort of trying to have access to these two people's minds, I sort of built my empathy from the ground up.
Got it. Well, why don't we jump into how you would just define empathy? This is a term that I think is used in, well, let me scratch that. Let me correct the record. I know it is a term that is used in lots of different ways, not only outside of academia, but within academia as well. In research, people have lots and lots of definitions. So let's just kind of like set the record straight from the outset. What's your definition of empathy?
Yeah, thanks for starting here, Ethan. I think it's so important because it's a simple word, but a complex idea. And over the course of my career, I've heard, really, I kid you not, thousands of different definitions of empathy, all of which were reasonable, but not all of which are identical. And I think that when we get confused about what empathy is, it becomes much harder to talk about. I think some of that confusion arises because empathy, as researchers like me understand it, is not one thing at all. It's an umbrella term that describes at least three ways that we connect with other people's emotions. So, for instance, Ethan, let's say that I hopped on this Zoom call and was not thrilled to talk with you and feeling great about talking about empathy with all the people here, but instead I was in anguish. I was crying. You could tell that something was wrong, but you didn't know what. Well, as you saw me break down, a bunch of things probably would happen inside you. One, you might feel bad yourself, vicariously catching or sharing my emotions, which we would call emotional empathy. Second, you might try to figure out what is going on with Jamil. What is he feeling? And what happened that made him feel that way? That detective work of trying to enter somebody else's perspective is what we would call cognitive empathy. And third, because I know from much experience that you're a very good friend, you would probably care about what I was going through. And you might think, how could I help Jamil? How could I improve his well-being? That desire to improve what other people are feeling, to enhance their well-being, is what we might call compassion or empathic concern. Now, these pieces of empathy are connected with one another, but they also split apart in all sorts of interesting ways. For instance, they're supported by different parts of the brain, and they're affected in different conditions. People with autism spectrum disorders sometimes struggle to understand what other people feel, but are perfectly able to share and care about what others feel. People with psychopathy often have the opposite profile, able to understand others, but with less of a connection to what those people are feeling.
And are they equally malleable? And I don't want to go too much into teaching and empathy because we'll get to that a little bit later, but I can't resist asking that question now.
Yes. So all of these pieces of empathy can be moved by our experiences, whether those are momentary experiences or long-term experiences. But to your question, I would say that the malleability of compassion and cognitive empathy is greater than the malleability of emotional empathy. Emotional empathy is a little bit more of a reflex. Evolutionarily, it's older. We share it with more species, and it arises earlier in our lives. So infants, for instance, feel lots of emotional empathy, but not a ton of cognitive empathy. So it's the least changeable of the three, but that doesn't mean that it's stuck in place.
Well, you mentioned evolution, which gets me to the next question. I think a question that lots of people have, which is, we have this is like a remarkable force. It's a kind of social glue, empathy, to some degree. Why did we evolve this capacity? What function does it serve? Is it purely adaptive? What's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, lots to say about this. First of all, I mean, look at us as a species. We're not that impressive. You notwithstanding, Ethan, you are quite
Hey, I take
impressive,
I
but
take some offense at that, but okay.
but the rest of us who are not you are not that impressive, right? We are medium-sized mammals. We're not that strong or large or fast. We're not very good swimmers, and we can't fly at all. We're just not built to survive and thrive in a world full of other animals and beings. And yet we're here. We're the dominant species on the planet. Why? Well, one huge reason for that is not what we can do alone, but what we can do together. Our ability to collaborate, to be there for one another and support one another, it has helped us do everything from hunt woolly mammoths to build suspension bridges. And undergirding that ability to collaborate, there must be some connection that people have for one another, some willingness to help other people. And it turns out that empathy is a psychological fuel for that type of togetherness, for stitching together communities and building coalitions, which is one of the big secrets to our species' success. So that's the kind of ultimate evolutionary reason that a lot of scientists see for empathy. But it's also worth noting that empathy helps us right now in lots of ways. We often think of empathy as a gift that we give to other people, but it turns out it's a gift for ourselves as well. People in my research, people who experience lots of empathy for their friends also tend to be happier, less stressed, and less lonely. And empathy, of course, helps us form and keep really important relationships in our lives. So I think that there's a long-term benefit that empathy has had for our species, and also a short-term benefit that all of us who empathize experience, which is the joy and the power of being together.
Yeah, hearing you talk, it reminds me of the social intelligence hypothesis about why we develop these giant, beautiful, big brains. The idea is that we've got to coordinate with other people, and empathy is a critical piece of doing that well. So you just mentioned a bunch of positives when it comes to empathy. And empathy is this really interesting topic when in the discussions that I have with people about empathy. And these are more just, kind of, I'm not doing research in the space. These are just kind of colloquial conversations. People tend to be split in terms of binning empathic experiences into one zone, that this is a desirable attribute. And in another bucket, these people think, well, no, this is a vulnerability, it's a weakness. And I actually see this distinction between thinking about empathy as a positive versus a negative. It really comes out when I'm talking to people in organizational contexts, when I'm
Yes.
talking to people about leadership and how to govern organizations. I'd love to hear you weigh in on that. But before you do with your rapid fire set of findings from your own lab, which has set the record straight, I want to turn it back to being a little personal, because one of the most actually chilling moments in my life, thinking about my relationship with you over the past 20 years, is when we spoke on the phone shortly after your first daughter was born, Alma, and you described your experience with her in the hospital, and how that informed your experience of empathy with respect to its positive and negative side. So if you're willing, and you don't have to, uh, I would love for you to share that experience with everyone here to kind of steer us into that part of the conversation.
Of course. Yes, I'm happy to talk about that. So our first daughter, my wife and my first daughter, Alma, um, has always been perfect to us. But when she was born, it was really clear that things hadn't gone well. She wasn't crying. She wasn't breathing very much. It was just a uh, terrifying moment. She was whisked to a NICU, a neonatal intensive care unit, where a few days later it was discovered that she had had a stroke during her birth. And we were, of course, devastated by this news. I also was never more grateful to have training in neuroscience. I read everything that I could about perinatal stroke, and I was shocked and heartened by what I read, which is that if one must have a stroke, which we hope not, that doesn't happen, the best time to do it in your life is the moment that you're born. The brain is this incredibly resilient organ, and we are blessed and grateful that Alma now she's 7.5. She's doing terrifically well. She's basically a well child in the eyes of her neurologist. But nonetheless, that was a time of great trauma for my family and I. We were grateful for a community of support, including you, Ethan. So thank you for being there for us. But we were also enormously grateful for the caregivers that she had at this NICU at the University of California, San Francisco. I mean, these people were empathic superheroes. They sat with us through all of our questions and with all of our emotions, and really were there for us in a way that nobody else could be. So that was a bright side of empathy, I suppose, was the way that care from our community and the medical staff there helped us get through this moment. But as it was clear that Alma was going to be okay, I began worrying about the doctors and nurses and social workers who were caring for us. I was thinking, how do you do this? These people are drinking from a fire hose of human misery all the time. And if 12 hours a shift, then going home, taking care of their family and coming back and doing it again. So for my book, I went and shadowed the same unit where Alma spent the first weeks of her life. And I found this dark side that you're referring to, Ethan. These folks were, again, enormously empathic, but they were also drowning, I would say, in their own empathy. Many of the people there so devoted to their jobs, but also suffering symptoms of burnout, PTSD, depression, and anxiety. Some of them not sure that they could stay on and do the work any longer, even though it meant so much to them. And that to me is one of the biggest downsides of empathy, is that especially emotional empathy can get us caught in a cycle of sharing other people's pain so much that it overwhelms us, or so much that we can't make the decisions that we need to. I mean, that's obviously true for medical professionals, but don't you feel as though nowadays so many of us, maybe in a lesser form, are inundated with other people's pain, whether we're doom scrolling online or trying to manage people in our organizations who themselves are full of anxiety during the pandemic? I feel like a lot of us have entered into a place where empathy feels like it's just too much.
Yeah, I wondered do you think that this is fundamental to empathy? Because hearing you talk makes me think about really the challenge of skillfully managing our emotional life. And I think the issue that you're raising with empathy is an issue that that we struggle with in many contexts, which is there is enormous value that comes from different emotional experiences, empathy being one example of that. But there's also a sweet spot for experiencing that emotional response just enough. But if you go too longer or get mired in it for too long, it can become counterproductive. And I think one of the big problems is that we don't get taught like how to find that sweet spot, which is why, sneak peek, I'm so grateful for your work because you're going to teach us. But is that part of the way that you think about this, that there's this it's a tool, empathy. It's a really powerful tool, but it can take us in the wrong direction if we wield it inappropriately. And sometimes the real kicker here is that we've got great intentions. We
Yeah.
want to help others. We want to be supportive, but that doing that kind of takes us down too far. We end up suffering, and so do the people we're talking to as well.
No, I mean, you really nailed that, Ethan. And I think that for people who want to learn more about how we manage our emotions and what skills we can bring to bear in this, one book that I would really recommend is Chatter. I don't know if you know the
Ah,
author, Ethan. No,
funny.
it's Ethan, everybody. Ethan's book is one of the best on this topic. So it's unsurprising to me that you're insightful here. I mean, I think that from my perspective, it's exactly as you say. Empathy is this enormously powerful tool, but I think that people have stereotypes about the way that they're supposed to empathize. And I think that those stereotypes get in the way of A, them being effective for others, and B, them caring for themselves and providing what I would call sustainable empathy for other people. So let me try to get into that a little bit. When I ask people what empathy is, they usually tell me one of two things. It's walking a mile in someone else's shoes, which we would think of as cognitive empathy, or they tell me it's feeling what other people feel. And I think that empathy turns out to be both of those things and a third, as we've just talked about. But I think that sometimes people think that if I want to be empathic, the only thing that I can do is cry alongside somebody, is say that I feel their pain. And if I'm not doing that, then I'm not empathizing. I think that that's the mistake that a lot of us make, and I think it gets us in a lot of trouble. So first of all, emotional empathy turns out to be less useful in helping others get through their problems often than other forms of empathy. I mean, if I'm with my therapist, I don't want him weeping and saying, "Oh my goodness, your life really is terrible." I don't need him to mirror my emotions. I need him to be present with my emotions and show me something else, show me some hope or show me some care, right? So oftentimes just sharing other people's pain isn't what they want. Second, when people get into this emotional type of empathy, that's a risk factor for their own burnout. So I think that in terms of skillfully managing empathy, there are a couple of things that I would say. One, it's not just a volume knob that you can turn up and down. It's more like, I'm old enough to remember these stereos where they had equalizers. You could change different frequency bands, right? And I think that we can tune our empathy to suit our goals. If somebody's in a lot of distress in front of us, it might not be very adaptive or helpful to just say, turn on the floodgates. I want to feel all of that. It might be good to remember and keep a little bit of separation, but still show our care and curiosity for that person. Second, I think it's really critical for people to remember that empathy starts at home, that if we're not caring for ourselves, it's very difficult to successfully or sustainably care for other people. So self-compassion, practicing care and being there for ourselves is really critical to successful empathy, I would say.
Sorry, I made a note here. That was great. So let me share another pet peeve of mine, and I'm curious if you agree with it or not, which is you've just given a pretty nuanced explanation of the role that empathy plays in our lives, down to the level of there being like different levels in the equalizer that you might push up or
Right.
down. That's a very nuanced way of thinking about this. Yet people tend to think about empathy quite dichotomously, right? It's good or it's bad, de facto, one versus the other. You've been involved in some of these debates. There's a great, I think it was a New York Times debate that you got into after a book was published that was pretty strongly opposed to empathy and basically attributed a lot of problems in the world to empathic people. What is the danger of adopting this dichotomous view of empathy as good or bad?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, it's just inconsistent with the science. We know, anyone who studies emotion knows that emotions are not good or bad. They are here for a reason because they've served functions in our evolutionary past and continue to serve functions now. The feeling of disgust is not pleasant, but it helps us avoid pathogens. The feeling of anger is not pleasant, but it helps us approach goals that we need to approach. The feeling of embarrassment is not pleasant, but it helps us repair relationships. So I think that with any emotion, it's just critically important to get beyond black and white thinking just because it's inaccurate. But second, and I think you're getting at or you're implying this a little bit as well, it's not just inaccurate. When we have poor models of how emotions work, we don't work with them the way that we could, right? I mean, if we think that, okay, I need to be empathic now, so I need to feel everything that somebody else is feeling, you get overwhelmed. Then you say, okay, empathy is not working anymore. I need to turn into a Vulcan and turn it all off. You end up stuck between two states, neither of which are probably the one that you want to either help other people or have a healthy emotional life yourself. Right? So understanding that emotions, any emotion, including empathy, can be useful sometimes and not useful other times is absolutely critical to using it in an adaptive way.
Couldn't agree more. let's switch to talking about the workplace and leadership and how these empathic processes play in those contexts. There are a lot of people on this call. I don't know, do we call this a call? Zoom session?
Yes,
I
sure.
haven't updated completely. There are a lot of people who are really interested in organizational and leadership dynamics. And whenever I think about this topic, I'm remembered about advice that I got from a pretty distinguished person when I first started my job. At Michigan. And the advice was start off by not being empathic, right? Like put up a wall and keep things very businessy, right?
Mhm.
Don't show emotion, don't take an interest in someone's personal lives. And as people begin to prove themselves, then you can like begin to open up that wall, let people in. What's your take on that? And maybe we can use that piece of advice as a springboard for you to discuss the sweet spot of empathy in an organization.
Yeah, I think that that sounds like reasonable advice on the surface, and then sounds like a really inefficient way to get to know a workplace and to thrive within that workplace when you dig a little bit deeper. I mean, it sounds like this person was basically advising you to assume that you have combative or at best chilly relationships with everybody and wait for them to prove that you should think otherwise. And I think a lot of people approach the workplace that way. They think of empathy as a sort of vulnerability, like showing your belly in a context where that might not be the right thing to do because other people might be competitive with you. And maybe, as the old saying goes, nice people or kind people or empathic people might finish last. There are at this point decades of evidence that basically point in the opposite direction. I mean, I do want to hold space for the complexity of empathy in the workplace, just like the complexity of empathy in life. But I think that the punchline of a lot of the work here is that empathy is not really a neutral feature of work, that by and large, it is a positive feature of our work lives. So when people feel that their workplace is empathic, they tend to have greater morale. They tend to be less stressed and more resilient during difficult times. And they tend to have a greater intent to stay at their organizations. During the Great Resignation, EY ran a major survey of lots of people who had left their workplaces and found that more than half of them cited a lack of empathy from leadership as a reason that they left. So if we want to keep people in our organizations, making them feel seen and heard is a really huge advantage. Empathic individuals also tend to rise to leadership positions in organizations. I mean, I guess all of this is to say, in general, when a workplace is empathic, when people don't sort of keep their cards too close to the chest and instead communicate and show care, those workplaces thrive in social and emotional ways. But they also tend to thrive in bottom line and sort of productivity oriented ways. I mean, after all, collaboration is not just a bunch of people who are free agents who happen to be in the same room or on the same Slack channels, right? Work works when we share information and we feel a sense of safety, taking risks together and being creative with one another. And it turns out that empathy, when people feel that their team and leadership in particular are empathic, well, then they're more willing to share knowledge and perspective, to engage in organizational citizenship behaviors, helping out, and to take creative risks on their own. And these all fuel basically what people want in the workplace. So I often hear leaders, including in Silicon Valley where I work, telling me, okay, it's just hard to make this choice. Do I create an empathic and trusting organization, or do I create an organization that is successful on bottom line terms? And that, just thinking in those dichotomous terms, misses the point entirely. I mean, the good news here is that in general, when we create workplaces that are socially connected, we also create workplaces that are innovative and productive.
Uh, so many questions. So first of all, you've sold me on infusing empathy into the organization. Of course, you had me at this a long time ago. But if I were to role play now, let me role play a skeptic. Say, but look, I cannot lead effectively if I'm allowing every member of my team, if I'm experiencing their emotions, even not letting them overwhelm me, there are bottom line things that have to happen, right? Like I'm reminded of that Tom like there's no crying in baseball line, right? Like
Right.
this
Yeah.
embodies that. Was it not Tom Cruise?
Tom
Tom
Hanks.
Hanks. Tom Hanks, famous movie, right? So if you're faced with a leader, and I'm guessing you probably have dealt with leaders that espouse this point of view, maybe this is a Silicon Valley individual, what's your concrete advice to them about when to exercise empathy, when not? Is there a kind of if-then profile that characterizes when it's useful to lean in versus pull back? How do you sort that out as a
Yeah,
leader?
I think I get this question from leaders a lot of the time. And again, I think it comes down to definitional confusion, right? A lot of people think that empathy, like I've heard so many definitions of empathy from corporate leaders that strike me as funny or sad, right? So I've heard people, I had a C-suite executive tell me, empathy, it's a feminine quality only for women. It's like, okay, that's, what is this, 1950? I heard one leader told me empathy would mean that I'd have to hug everybody who works for me, which is, if you're even thinking about that, please talk to HR, you know? But I've also heard, I think, Ethan, what you're saying, if I empathize with everybody, how will I hold anybody accountable? That's the same as just letting everybody skate, not trying to meet performance goals and acquiescing to every single demand that people make of me. But that's not what empathy is at all. Empathy is cultivating curiosity about what other people are experiencing and expressing care for their well-being. That can be completely synchronous with also pushing people to be the best that they can be. In fact, I would argue that oftentimes empathy is confused with niceness or politeness, but should not be, right? I'll give you an example. In giving people performance feedback, oftentimes leaders will tell me, if I empathize, I just need to tell people about the good things that they're doing, and I can't tell them any places that they have as growth points. Well, that actually is a very shallow understanding of empathy and can actually harm people instead of helping them. For instance, people do this more with women than men. They'll give women vague praise, but not developmental feedback because they're trying to be nice. But that's actually sexist, right? Because it doesn't give women opportunities to grow. So oftentimes being empathic in the feedback that we give actually involves very much holding people accountable, very much pushing them, but doing so from a place of understanding and care, right? So starting by saying, well, I know that you have this capacity for growth, and here are some hurdles that I see in your way, and here's how we're going to get over those. So I think that long answer to a very sensible question, but I think that it's really important to understand that when we empathize, that doesn't mean pulling back on giving people honesty or on pushing them. Rather, it means doing so in a way that people honestly are more likely to positively receive and more likely to actually listen to.
Yeah, and hearing you talk, it reminds me of one of what I think is the most underrated programs of research in psychology, which is a Belgian psychologist. I know you know who this is, Bernard Rimet's work
Yes.
on how to talk about emotions with other people or how to share emotions. And super cool science boils down to two things. All human beings have two needs. We've got these social and emotional needs, which in a certain sense are all about empathy and connection. And then we also have like cognitive needs. Things need to get done. We need to deal with shit. Oh, sorry. I'm not sure if I was allowed to do that. Sorry, everyone. I caught it. Right? We've got the social, emotional, and then we've got the stuff has to get done, cognitive, and they're not mutually exclusive. And I think that sums up the big conundrum in society surrounding these issues. We often think they are, when I think the best leaders in organizations actually figure out ways to fit these two needs together. And so that's how I interpret what you're saying.
I would go a little bit further than that, Ethan. I think that oftentimes when people don't feel like they're being like their emotional needs are being met, they develop an adversarial stance with their workplace.
Absolutely.
They
Oh,
they
absolutely.
they do what these days the kids call quiet quitting, where you're still there, but you're just skating by doing the bare minimum. I think that when you show people that you are paying attention to them, that you're investing in them, they're much more likely to reciprocate and to actually be feel a sense of commitment to you as a leader or manager.
Completely agree. Okay, so you've sold everyone on the virtue of empathy in an organizational context. What are the challenges in taking this view of how to optimize organizations, both in terms of their culture as well as their bottom line? What are the challenges to infusing these kinds of principles into the organization? Or is it actually a lot simpler than one might think?
Well, I think both of these are true. So I work with lots of organizations where their starting point is, we believe in empathy. And it's like, great, okay, you believe in empathy. What are you going to do about it? There was a survey in 2018 that surveyed 150 CEOs and their employees. 87%, I believe, of the CEOs said empathy is critical to a company's bottom line, suggesting they were bought in. 92% of their own employees said that empathy was undervalued in their organization. More than half of employees in a major survey said that their company's commitment to empathy was shallow or hypocritical, that people were talking about it and not doing anything. So I think that there is a huge challenge in translating what I think leaders genuinely believe into what their people experience on the ground. Now, when I work with organizations, I try to do a couple of things. One is to start with a sense of empowerment. We've been talking about the way that empathy is a skill. We've been almost taking that as assumed in our conversation. I think a lot of people assume the opposite, that it's something that is fixed, that you can't build. And so I think a lot of leaders will say empathy is great and then not do much about it because they don't think that it's a skill that they or anybody else can develop. So I think that a sense of empowerment is really key. Second, I think that leaders often think that, well, I want to express empathy towards my people, so I'm going to do this thing that I would have wanted when I was an employee I'm going to give them casual Fridays or, low meeting Mondays or whatever. But that might not be what people actually need. I think that leaders often start with assumptions when they should start more with questions. A third piece is that I think that oftentimes leaders believe that empathy comes through one grandiose gesture. Okay, we're going to, do this big commitment to this charitable cause, for instance, as an organization. And that's great. But as with any other skill, empathy is built not by the big things that we do once, but by the habits that we perform every day. So when I work with organizations, I try to focus on those tiny but critical changes to the actions that we take, to the way that we interact on an everyday basis, and just encourage people to practice those skills, not just once, but regularly.
And, you don't just have the talking points here, you actually have data that you've produced from your lab, which shows how empathy can be grown and strengthened. So can you tell us a little bit about that research, which I absolutely love? And
Yeah.
let me before I'm going to cut you off. Sorry, you're not allowed to start yet. The reason why I want you to talk about this is because I think it is very easy in the space that we are operating in to be eloquent and talk a good game without having the goods to back it up. And what I often tell my students is you should often look past the talking points to see what evidence is there to support the claim. So you've got the evidence, give it to us.
Yeah, well, so a couple of places that we've done work. So one is on this sense of empowerment. So I'm sure that many people on this call, we're calling it a call, are familiar with Carol Dweck's great work on growth mindset, right? That, for instance, when people know that intelligence is a skill, they work harder at it. Well, we found the same is true of empathy. When people think that it's a fixed trait, they don't work as hard to connect with others, especially other people who are different from them, like politically or racially different from themselves. But when we teach people in our lab that empathy is a skill, they work harder at it. And that's not just over the course of a single experimental session. In some great work with my graduate student, Erica Wise, she taught people that empathy was a skill right when they got to college. And then at the end of their freshman year, she measured how many friends they had made on campus. And she found that people who learned early in college that empathy was a skill made, on average, one more friend in the subsequent year. I know one might not sound like a big number, but I mean, one friend at the beginning of college is quite meaningful. And basically what we're finding is that if you cultivate this sense of possibility in people and empower them, then they're more likely to reach out and actually make those connections. Another thing that we found with Erica is really important is people's social norms. So it's great to talk about empathy and how useful it is. But if you're in a culture that we could call toxic, where people are highly competitive or cruel or rude, that it's very difficult to feel like you can, it's very difficult to feel safe being empathic. And so what we've found in research on middle schoolers actually is that when you convince people or show them how popular empathy is among their class, they actually start to act more kindly themselves. This is something I think leaders can really act on. I mean, I'll always say if people want their culture to be more empathic, they should make empathy loud. And I think it's so easy to pay attention to that one toxic person in our social environment. But when I interview people in organizations, I often find that they think that the average person in their organization is much less empathic than the average person really is. So I think letting people show their empathy is a really critical skill as well. But these are just some of the ways that we found that you can build empathy over the long term.
And I think it's worth stating really clearly, and I know you believe this to be true, or at least I think you do, that being competitive and being empathetic are not mutually exclusive. And I
No,
think that's a critically important idea to convey. It reminds me of a meeting I just had with some students right before this presentation, where they were bemoaning the fact that at the business school here, there was a noticeable lack of community and empathy, and they attributed it to the fact that people are really competitive.
yeah.
And so I think for folks on the call, and there are some questions that are bubbling up around this, we're going to transition soon to those questions. Just for the record, we can have both. Yes.
Yes, absolutely. And one way of thinking about this is that empathy within a group actually helps that group be really competitive. There's great work on the NBA. I happen to be a huge Boston Celtics fan. Ethan, I know you love Boston sports as much as I do.
Unfortunate.
And there is this great research where they scraped the tweets of NBA players, and they found that more narcissistic NBA players, their teams did worse over the course of the season because they passed the ball less. And I think that that's a great study in and of itself. I think it's also a metaphor for so much of life. I mean, to compete is oftentimes to compete as a team against others. And, competition, first of all, can be very friendly. But second of all, to thrive in that competition, it's often really important that the people who are working together are very in sync. And empathy is a huge part of that.
Yeah, it reminds me of one of my favorite findings in social psychology, how one of the best ways of helping yourself is to help other people, which I know you admire as well. Well, why don't we switch to going through a couple of questions, because we have many. One question concerns the dark side of empathy and how we can manage it. So do you have any suggestions about tools that people can use when they find themselves going too far, both in terms of tools that people can use to recover from the after effects of burnout, so to speak, but also things that people can potentially do to buffer themselves against falling victim to that state down the road?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing that I would say is that Kristen Neff and Christopher Germer's work on mindful self-compassion is enormously powerful. I'll share in the spirit of vulnerability that I had a lot of burnout early in the pandemic from sort of caring for the people in my lab and in my life. And their programs on self-compassion helped me enormously. And again, I think that it's this toggling between caring for others and then making sure that you're taking breaks to take care of yourself. And then I would also add, again, this sense of tuning. It's really important to remember that empathizing doesn't have to mean sharing everything that people feel. You have not failed to empathize if you're not in it with somebody else. In fact, they might not want you to be in it with them. They might want you to keep that little bit of distance so you can have a perspective that is different than theirs. I mean, your own work has found that when people can cultivate that distance perspective, they often are more effective at providing advice to other people or helping them. So I think it's okay to be a little bit distanced. That's preventative. And then if you find yourself suffering from burnout, going back to self-compassion would be my suggestion.
What do you do when a person, when you're really good at being that empathic agent to someone else and they don't reciprocate back to you? There's one question here with a couple of up fingers, thumbs up, which suggests that resonates with people. And I must say, like, I've resonated with this, like, there's a reciprocity that governs social relationships. So what should you do? Should you teach that person in that such, hey, you know what, I'm pretty empathic to you, you're not
What's
giving
going
anything back? Do you
what's
cut
going
them
on here?
out?
Yeah.
Any advice there?
Yeah, I think first of all, no one owes empathy to anybody else, right? So if you feel that you're in a one-sided relationship that's just draining you and not giving anything back, if you're able to, if it's not maybe someone in your family, for instance, then I think that it's fair to pull back. I mean, we are all in a social marketplace, and we can make connections and strengthen connections that are mutually beneficial. But I would also say that oftentimes people's apparent lack of empathy hides something else. I mean, you know as well as I do that oftentimes the emotion that people express isn't the same as what they're feeling. Sometimes somebody who seems angry might be anxious. Somebody who seems bored might be sad. And so I think that it's worth, in my opinion, sometimes just cultivating a little bit more curiosity and saying, okay, this person's not showing up the way that I think they should. What might be going on with them that is getting in their way? I think oftentimes when we ask the right questions, we might be surprised at what somebody else is going through and what's underneath their apparent callousness.
So DEI is a huge issue right now, and not surprisingly, it has also come up in the questions. Uh, how do you think empathy plays into our ability to successfully navigate the kinds of DEI challenges that we now face? And by challenges, I mean we've got some serious discrepancies here in terms of resources that people have access to, glass ceilings, and the sort. Do we need more empathy? Do we need less? Is it there's frustration on both sides, with the marginalized parties being upset with the people on the other side and vice versa? How does empathy factor into all this?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not necessarily a matter of too much or too little empathy. I think one real issue for inclusion is which direction is empathy going in. So there's a lot of work on something known as the power paradox, which is that empathy helps us rise to positions of power, privilege, influence, and status. But achieving those things often makes it harder to empathize. I mean, I know I experience this with my graduate students all the time. People who don't have power spend a lot of time thinking about the mind and heart of a person who has power over them. And that's not always reciprocated. My students will often send me these like emails that are 5-paragraph essays. You can tell that they've invested so much time and energy into trying to curate a message that will
You
get
you
through to
you
me.
get those too?
Yeah. And I'll write back, sounds GERD, which is just a typo for good, and oftentimes, it's just hard as somebody in power to pay as much attention to other people as they're paying to us. But that can create real barriers to inclusion, because it's not just the case, as you're saying, that some groups have more access, resources, and opportunities. It's also the case that those groups often don't realize what it's like to not have those things. An empathy gap, right? One that goes, again, where people who don't have historic privilege and power have to understand the perspective of people who do as a survival skill, and that doesn't go the other way. So one thing that I think is really useful is what I call perspective getting. Not just assuming that we know what other people feel, especially if their identity is different from ours, but cultivating curiosity and asking lots of questions, and basically reversing that empathy hierarchy. If you are in a position of power, it's just enormously useful to show real curiosity for the experience of people who are not. And if you're not in a position of historic power, privilege, or status, it's enormously empowering and connective to feel as though you are being heard. So oftentimes I think, again, sort of reversing that hierarchy and being intentional about people with historic privilege and power, listening to people who don't have that, can be really can be a really great and powerful avenue for inclusion.
That's great. I will correct you though, that you mentioned that GERD was a typo for good.
Good.
It's also a middle-aged disease that some people experience, gastro reflux
Right,
disease.
right.
Um, that's what came to mind for me, which maybe is projecting here. So we value qualitative work a lot here at Ross and at the university more generally, and we have some people on the call who avail themselves of that kind of ethnographic work. And there are some questions about how do we go about observing empathy in an organization in a rigorous way, becoming that fly on the wall, especially when so much of empathy is happening behind the scenes in our minds and bodies. Do you have any advice about how to tackle that kind of issue?
Yes, I love that question, and really enjoy qualitative work and think it combines so well with quantitative work. I think that observing empathy is often not about observing a person, but rather it's about observing the people around that person. Apologies for my second NBA reference of the day, but one of my favorite players in the league is Chris Paul. Chris Paul is a point guard, and he's really a talented individual player. But an extraordinary thing about him is that 4 times the team that he's joined has had their best record ever within 2 years of him joining. In other words, he makes the people around him a lot better. And I think that when trying to observe empathy, you can ask somebody about their own empathy and their values, and they'll tell you. But I think it's more powerful to see whether the individuals around around a leader, for instance, are thriving, and what they say about their experience of the workplace, not just their experience of that leader, but how they feel. And I think that one way that empathy comes out is in a sense of safety and a sense of received empathy from people around them. And pursuant to what we were talking about with respect to inclusion, I think it would also be represented by equally high levels of empathy and safety and involvement in the organization experienced by people across identity boundaries.
Okay, we're now going to transition to the part of the program where I present you with rapid fire questions that require 10 to 15-second responses to see if we could get in a few other interesting
Sure.
nuggets here. So, so one question is, do you find, or do you know of research which shows that as you succeed in bolstering the empathic healthiness of an organization or group, that you get more convergence between how one person thinks about how empathic they are and how the people on the other side think about how empathic that person is? So like leaders and employees.
Yeah, yes. I mean, so in essence, there's more alignment in cases. I mean, I'd say that there's more alignment on both ends of the spectrum. Very unempathic organizations, everybody seems to know that, except sometimes the people right at the top. Very empathic organizations, people seem to be aligned and in agreement as well. It's the folks in the middle where there's the least agreement.
Okay, now next question. There's a safe response, which I'm not going to allow you to take. So sorry. But the question has to do with culture, multinational corporations, and how we go about tackling this empathy challenge when dealing with individuals who come from different cultural backgrounds or work in different cultural contexts. The easy answer is that, of course, culture matters. So you need to take that into account, but you're not allowed to say that. So what do you do? Have you thought about it? And if you haven't, that's fine.
I think humility matters. People worry that they're supposed to know what is appropriate and valued and useful in interacting with somebody from another culture. So they pretend like they know because they're too scared to say that they don't know. But I would say that empathy across culture is often about immediately saying, look, I don't know, and I count on your guidance to tell me what is the best way to interact with you and what matters to you in this in this interaction or in the work we're doing together.
Well, I think that note is a perfect note to end this conversation because it speaks to your humility as a scientist and person. This was super fun for me. I know from the energy level that I see in the Q&A that it was super fun and stimulating for the people who joined us as well. Thank you, Jamil, for taking the time. For folks who are on the call, there is going to be an email sent out early next week that's going to have a video link in case you want to fact check and study what Jamil and I have said. And there are also maybe some resources that Jamil shares, which we will send to all of you as well. This is our final session of the academic year. We're going to kick it off again next September. Until then, have a fantastic spring and summer, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Ethan. Thanks, everybody.
Take care.